Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. I've been meaning to make some beginner style tutorials specifically for soft pastel, so here's the first one. How would you guys like to work along with me for the next 2 hours, step by step, and produce your own little soft pastel seascape? So this one I produced in a workshop earlier this year in Holland, and it took just about 2 hours to produce. I'm hoping to recreate this one on a slightly larger size, and I'm aiming to do it within 2 hours. So if you'd like to work along with me, here's how you can do that. I'm working on the light yellow colour Velour pastel paper, but don't worry if you haven't got this paper. You can work along on any type of pastel paper. I use many different types: pastel matte, UArt, Velour, just to name a few. And it doesn't really matter what type of pastel paper you've got, just something that will take many layers of soft pastel. But I highly recommend both Velour and pastel matte if you're just starting out. I've also mounted my sheet of Velour paper on some self-adhesive foam board. Not completely necessary if you're having a go at this as a beginner. I've mounted this as, if it turns out nice, maybe I'll do something with it, put it in a frame. And I always mount the paper that I'm planning on doing something later with, as it makes it stronger and easier to manage. So I'll get this taped onto my drawing board and show you what colours you might need to work along. So here I've got my pastel paper taped to my drawing board and on an easel, and I gave myself a rough outline on some regular drawing paper, which I then covered in black pastel and transferred onto my pastel paper. You can see a full video on how I do that on my YouTube channel. And in this moment on screen, I'll add a still of the photo reference that I'm going to be working from. You can pause the video here and use this to sketch out your line drawing, or if you're on my Patreon channel, you can go there and download the reference image along with a gridded version and other things to help. So let's have a quick look at the palette of colours that I've laid out. So for under 20 different colours, you can produce quite a complicated seascape with some areas of sea, sky, land, buildings. So this small number of pastels can cover quite a lot. And this would be quite a popular range of colours that I would choose for a sunset especially. So I'll add the codes here. If you have something similar to these, you can always substitute your own colour choices. But it's mostly the Unison soft pastel sticks that I'm going to be using. I'll also make use of a small number of pastel pencils, and I'll also make use of some black Faber Castell sticks. So let's make a start on the piece, and I'm going to work from the background through to the foreground and try and build up that sense of depth in the landscape. So background with less detail, and see if any detail that we have time for this foreground area. So the first colour I'm picking up is a bit of grey 8, just to fill in some of the darkest areas in the sky over towards the right. And my main tip for these early layers on any paper, but especially Velour, is just to make sure that you don't lean heavily. So I'm not filling the tooth of the paper here. I'm really just using the side of the pastel to start and block in where I see those cloud formations. And I want to try and be quick with this. Setting myself a 2-hour time limit. So I want to ignore as much detail as possible and just go for the main shapes and colour values. So this seemed quite dark to begin with, but there's a lot of depth to the sky over here, and my next layers will lighten it up. So it's really just like a thin wash of colour there to begin. And I continue on across the horizon now, picking up a much warmer colour. You can see that the source of light is coming from over on the left side here, where we've got the setting sun. And again, I'm just using these two colours to quickly block in some cloud shapes. And now bringing in a lighter yellow, quite similar to the paper colour. I'm not worried about going really strong with the colours at this stage. The great thing about pastel is that it layers up gradually, and you want to start with your stronger colours to create some depth in your painting. So I'm just filling in a bit of the rest of the sky with some of that yellowy glow that I can see, and also some areas amongst these clouds where I can see some gaps. I'm really not trying to copy these clouds photographically. I've done this painting at 40 inches wide and I really did the sky in a lot of detail, but for this quick demo I'm trying to be quick, so as little detail as possible. I'm coming in with some grey 27, starting to add some of the light to that top corner. And I can also use this grey 27 now to start and shape some of the clouds from above. But when I want to get a large area of colour, I'm using the side of the pastel, nice and softly, not leaning too heavily. So again, just shaping some of the clouds in the sky using the lighter colours. And then, as always on Velour, I give everything a good rub into the paper. It just gets all my layers to blend together and makes sure none of the pastel is sitting loose on the surface of the paper. So now I can bring in some of the lighter lilacs and start to work more on the clouds over here. Just looking for any interesting shapes that do jump out to me. And as I start to bring the lilacs across the sky, I'm really looking for the area where the two colours in the sky really start to mix. And you get a lovely gradient that flows right across a sunset sky. I'm also not worried about coming right down to the line of the land. I don't actually mind if I overlap that a little bit. It will help later on when I'm adding that strip of land in. And the beautiful thing about sunsets, guys, is you get such a mixture of colours, and that effect can be built up really well using pastel. You don't have to put just one colour down. Like I'm doing here, you can feather your colours over the top of other colours, mixing them on the paper. But that's kind of what these clouds are like when you look at them. And when you start to blend those colours together, you can start to get a nice gradient happening. So now with this yellow colour, I can even start to pick out a little bit of light shining through some of the clouds. And again, thinking about the shape of the clouds from the sky, how I can shape that top edge of the cloud using the colour of the sky. So now I can really start to use those layers to build in some rich gradients of colour. I've sort of got the clouds mapped out at this stage. Now it's just going around building up some of the layers. Trying to capture how the light shines through some of those areas in the clouds. I'll also take a little bit of white for the very top corner. You really want to limit your use of white in a sunset, but just for the very brightest, most exposed area, it adds a lovely glow. And you already start to get a sense of which side of the sky the sun is setting on. So just starting to bring some of that warmth further across the sky. Using two really lovely vibrant colours. I've used these two colours together in many sunsets. So throughout this painting we're going to try and make each little area of land sit nicely into the distance. And one trick to start working on that is to think about the colour of your sky right next to the horizon. So normally the sky gets lighter as it comes down towards the horizon. And especially in this piece I want to try and capture some of that distant misty appearance. So I'm using this very light lilac just to add a little bit of misty colour down at the horizon line, and that's going to help my first layer of land really pop out. I don't want it to look like a harsh line, so I'm really just adding the pastel so softly and trying to gradate it up into the clouds above. And once we come over to this side, then I continue the lilac for a little bit, but that lighter colour next to the horizon should get warmer as we get closer to the sun. So I want to take my grey 27 pastel on its side, and at this stage I want to knock everything back and start to help it all blend together nicely. This is something that I do a lot on velour paper, so if you're using velour in particular, you can try this out. And just starting at one side, again not leaning heavily, but enough to put a little film of pigment onto the paper. And just going right down over the whole sky. Then when I blend that together, all of those colours start to mix, but with just a little film of that grey 27 over the top of it. Just starts to help things look really nice and smooth and blended. So now that I've knocked it back a layer, I can start having a little bit of fun with a bit of colour. Again, I'm not trying to describe this sky really photographically. Just trying to give a sense of the cloud shapes, but more importantly, the lovely glowing colours. So I'm looking at my photo reference a lot, trying to pick out which parts of these clouds I really want to accentuate. I'm looking for anywhere that I can see that the clouds are nicely backlit. So paying attention to which edges need to be a little more crisp to show that backlighting, and which edges need to be really nice and soft and blended. So you can see that I'm really mixing those blue violets with the lovely orange tones over the top. And I found that on most pastel papers, the more gradually I try and build up a smooth gradient, the smoother I get it. So going in with thick layers to begin with is usually a bad idea. I also like to use some really super vibrant yellows. Sometimes it's just a little bit of glow right over this side of the sky. You can be so brave with your colour choices on a sunset. I really encourage you to choose your own palette for this. Try and pick some of the more vibrant colours that you don't get to use as much if you've got some pastels already. But maybe these colours will help you if you're trying to decide what type of colours you would need in order to paint sunsets. So you don't have to use the exact colours that I'm using. Hopefully you can substitute for something similar in your own collection. So this sky isn't a sky that I would call in any way done, but we're on a quick demo, so I'm going to move on to the first layer of land. And if we look at it from this side, I'm coming in with some of my vibrant orange. But as you look across this slither of land, or any of the land, you'll see that it changes colour as it goes from left to right. So obviously the light is affecting it differently over here. and it really changes its colour as it progresses across the painting. And I'm just trying to block in some of the land behind the castle. Notice I've picked a photograph of a ruined castle, so at least there aren't too many straight edges to worry about. And it's the same with the land here. I'm really not being too concerned about getting each little shape on the top of the mountains absolutely perfect. And there's such a small amount of that land visible in some places. I also want to work at the mistiness of the land, so I'll fill in just the rest of this area that runs right across the beach. These are actually giant sand dunes on the north coast of Ireland. This is Dunluce Castle, a really beautiful place. I've painted it a few times now, so that's why I'm hoping that I can do it in a short amount of time, because I'm really familiar with it. So this is quite a nice neutral colour, just to fill in a little bit of the land, just as a base tone. And just roughly in between the buildings there as well. I'm really not being too neat at this stage, but making sure to rub those layers in as I go. So the land behind this, a little bit more in the distance. And each layer of land as it goes back needs to be lighter in colour so that it recedes nicely into the distance. And of course this slither of land in the far distance isn't really bright lilac, but I did say that you could be a bit brave with your colour choices on a landscape, so have a go, see if you can push the colour choices a little bit more than you normally would, because sometimes fun things happen when you do that, and it's maybe a colour that you wouldn't normally have put there, so it's fun to experiment a little too. So just back in from above again. I'm going to try and neaten the land just a little bit, and now that I can see roughly the colour of the land, I know I've got to make the sky just a little bit lighter along this to help it stand out. So just lightening the sky at the horizon line there. And then I can soften that top edge back into the clouds again so that it doesn't look like a hard line. Once you get a couple of layers of pastel on the paper, it all starts to happen because you can start to blend things together. Up until that point, it's quite tricky. Once you've only got a layer of pastel on the paper, you'll find it wants to stick and not move very much. But once you get some pastel going on the paper, then things become easier. So my advice is always just to jump in and start getting some colour down. As long as you don't lean heavily, then you're going to be able to work over the top of it, correct any mistakes. So the next little layer of land, just start to block that in. or at least get the outline of it again. And it's quite fiddly on a small scale, just to get in between all the buildings. But I still like to use the big pastel sticks for this. Don't mind if I go over my edges a little bit, because you'll see as I work on, you can start to neaten things into place. So always coming in with my darkest colours first. You can see how much I lightened that blue, that dark blue that I came in with first on the sky. Gives it much more depth, but you can lighten it as much as you need to later on. So again, with that top row of land, just using my sky colour to start to help that stand out more. So just following each segment of land across the horizon and looking at how it changes colour as it goes. You can see that I'm able to find lots of little edges on the pastels. You'd be surprised at just how much detail you can get with the soft sticks alone. They always start to become much more useful when they start to break. So what you want is your pastels in lots of shapes and sizes for all sorts of different jobs. And that's just the end of that little section of land there. And I want to make sure that that stands out quite nicely. Now again, using the side of the light lilac colour, the colour I've used in the background land, just bringing some of that mist down over these hills in front. And you can see that this particular dune actually peeps out of the mist. So So it's so easy just to get little subtle bits of detail like that, where you're using the pastel to create a sort of misty effect. Pastel's great for that. So you're always thinking of the bottom of the area of land being a little bit lighter, a bit like at the horizon line on the sky. If you can gradiate each little bit of land lighter as it comes down to meet the next bit of land, then you're really going to help them stand out against each other. So you always want your landscapes to have darker contrast as you come forward in the composition. That's going to help you create that sense of depth. And again, I just want to knock this area of land back a little bit. So just using the side of the pastel really lightly. So this is probably the most time consuming part of this piece, and it's simply because those little slithers of land are quite small, so it takes a little bit of time just to fill them in and get some nice colours flowing across them. You can also make use of a little bit of pastel pencil at this point. Sometimes when I'm just trying to get the outline of the next mountain range, I can just help it along a little bit with the pastel pencil. Always good to have some pencils. They offer you that fine precision point that you're definitely missing with the bigger soft pastels. So the next little layer of land here is a little bit darker. And I also want to start and bring in just a little hint of some green. So the land that's in the distance, you're not getting any of the green colours that would be on those hillsides. They're too far in the distance. But as things start to come closer, you can start to see a little bit of the hue of the land. And again, I want to take my lighter colour and just wash this area out a little bit as well. Barely touching the paper by doing this, but everything just starts to blend together nicer. So this is a paper tortillon. They come in different sizes and it's just rolled up paper, points on either end. And this is a little tool that I use sometimes just to redefine an edge. I'm really using the tool to scrape away the top layer of pastel and reveal a little bit of my darker colour underneath. So I can do that in certain areas, like across here along the tops of the dunes that are peeking out of the mist. I can expose some of the darker pastel again and make those areas a little darker. Just a useful trick for when you want to accentuate something. So we're starting to get a little bit of a feel of the distance between each of these areas of land. The next area I'm going to work on is the mid-ground area where we have both the sea and the castle. So I'm just lightening around the edges of the castle a little bit now so that it'll definitely stand out when I add that in. So again, another little thin film of colour just to knock this land back a bit. And you can see that so far I've been using all of those lovely warm colours from the sky, from the sunset, also to create the land, and that helps give the effect that that sunset lighting is reflecting around off everything. So I'll make a start on the sea area. And the first thing I can see is this area of really light water where the water's breaking on the land. And I'm using some BV7 for this. It's a really icy light coloured blue. One of my favourite colours to use. And that's really like the colour of the waves breaking on the shore. Right along that strip of land. And now just to block in a little bit of the sea, using a deeper, more vibrant blue here, sort of a mid-tone colour. And again, just a very thin film of colour, just to block it in quickly. Now to start building up some of the waves very quickly and loosely in the sea, I take some of that grey 8 that I used initially on the sky, and I'm just starting to look for some of the darker marks in the ocean, some of the places that I can pick out some hint of the waves. But again, I don't want to go into much detail here, so trying to keep it really loose. Just following the waves as they come around the bay. Trying to notice always the direction of any of the marks that I'm making. So with waves, a lot of the time what you're going to be doing is making little horizontal lines just to give the impression of the waves, and then we'll try and pick out some colours to hint at some of the white tops on the waves. And of course the lines that you're making get smaller as they go into the distance. So again, just to strengthen up that lovely icy blue along this edge, the water meets the land. And you can see that a lot of my first layers on any section of the piece look pretty messy and rough. As long as you get the correct tones down in the first layers, you don't need to worry too much about it looking neat or correct in the first layers. It quite often has to look a bit rough before things start to look right. And just to help start to even things up, I'm going to quickly block in the castle. That way we'll really start to get a feel for this whole middle area coming together. So just go in carefully, trying to aim the pastel in roughly the right place. Don't have to worry about the edges too much. I can come back and work at those. Just trying to get the main shapes blocked in. I've chosen this deep purple colour. Of course I'm going to layer other colours over the top of it, but I'm really trying to keep the whole palette of this piece nice and warm using sunset glowing tones, and I find that this lovely dark purple works really well in a sunset. So I'm going to break my pastel and hopefully find a few smaller edges, make this job a little easier. So it's just tricky getting in all the little shapes. Just taking my time going across. Much easier done with a nice small shard of pastel like this. It's really not a problem getting any size of detail if you've got your pastels in lots of different sizes, so don't be worried about breaking them, or if you drop one, just treat it as a happy accident. And it's a really stunning castle on the north coast of Ireland. This, you come round the bend in the road and you get hit with this very view. It's really spectacular. I suppose what's more unusual in this is the fact that the sun was shining that day. We don't get a lot of sun in Ireland. So that's the top line of the castle, pretty blocked in. Got the general shape of it. Just fill it in a little bit more. Okay, and give it a little bit of rub into the paper. I want to be careful with this little edge here. I don't want to lose that, so I'm not rubbing right over the edges. Just getting the main bits of pigment rubbed into the paper. And now any little windows that I can see, then of course I can come in and shape those bits by uncovering some of my darker value underneath. And bit by bit then I can start to work on both the sea and the castle area. With the sea I start to bring out some more of the white foam. And especially down this side of the castle, that really helps it stand out. I also bring a darker grey into the sea with some of those horizontal marks, especially towards the foreground. Just looking for any of the darkest waves. But don't get these darker colours in first, it's much more difficult to add them in later on, so I can be a bit too heavy-handed at this stage and still be able to make it light enough later. And just around about here we've got a lovely breaking wave. Again, I can't go into much detail, but I can hopefully hint at that lovely white topped wave. Bringing some of my blue marks back into the sea. Trying to now aim them in between the other marks that I've made. Starting to build up a little bit of texture to the waves. And remember, those marks get smaller as you move away into the distance until it's really just bands of colour. I also bring in my light lilac colours from the sky. Again, just always smoothing those marks into the ones underneath. All the time making these small horizontal marks just to give some effect of the moving waves. And for that little splash of a wave, just using my light lilac. And I'll use some of my grey 27 on the front of the wave. And it's such a tiny thing within the whole composition, so it's just a matter of getting the angle of the bottom of it to look right. We've also got some other little highlights of foam just running along the shoreline. And a couple of small breakers in between. Just a few hints at little bits of foam. Let's move back over onto the castle and do a bit more work there. So I'm going to quickly block in the big area of cliff that the castle is sitting on. And not very successfully sitting on, because half of it fell into the sea quite a few years ago. I'm using my BE36. This is a really lovely dark brown, but it's also got a bit of green content to it. And I want to use both it and my dark purples to create this area. So it's really dark in here in the photo reference, and that's doing me a big favour because it means I literally can't go into huge amounts of detail. But let's see what we can do to at least make this area still quite interesting. So it's really dark down at the bottom, especially towards where the sea meets it. And of course, like everything else in the composition, it gets a bit lighter over towards this side. But you can see immediately, just by getting some big areas blocked in the foreground, it starts to make sense of all that wishy-washy colour in the background. I'm just getting a little film of this colour all over. Not in a thick layer, as you can see. You can still see the paper through what I've done. Trying already to mark out some of the structural elements that I can see in the photo reference. So one thing I can start to do to neaten up the top row of the castle, bringing in a little bit of pastel pencil. And it's a really old castle, so I don't want to be too particular about this. I just want to heighten the contrast a little bit between the castle and the background. It just helps each of those layers within the composition stand out. And again, I'm not leaning very heavily with the pastel pencil here. Most of what I'm doing in a landscape is quite subtle, especially on this scale. So again, making use of a little shard of pastel. And if you make little mistakes in pastel, quite forgiving usually. Most things can be undone or at least hidden. So this is the first time that I'll pick up any black pastel. Because we're coming closer to the foreground, I can afford to let some of the contrast start to get pretty heightened. And the more you see of that for the foreground, the more you're going to make your background look really far away in the distance. So I start to bring in a little bit of black just to creep up from the bottom of these cliffs. I won't leave it black. I'll come in with my other colours. But I don't mind using a bit of black just to get the initial depth and darkness. While I have the black in my hand, I'll also block in these little walls in the foreground. Sometimes with landscapes I like to not focus on just one area. If I can work on and block in, then it's good to do that because you get to see the picture more as a whole. You get to see it develop all together instead of one area at a time. I often work on my portraits, my pet portraits especially. When there's a lot of fur, it just makes sense to work it in a certain way. But with landscapes I do find I work a little bit differently. More across the entire picture where it's possible. And of course at the moment the black looks much too dark here. I'm just adding it in as a base layer to work on. So now I'll work my way across the castle. See if I can pick out any of the structural elements using the dark tones first, so looking for the shadows. And I love that there's not a lot of detail to be seen in the hazy light. That definitely gives me some free license to be a bit looser with this. So now just across the castle, I'm going to start to bring a little bit of that light across from the left of the sky. Of course, everything over here has to be a little bit lighter, leaving the most contrasted dark areas in this middle section. And of course I can use the little paper tortillon to help neaten some of those edges. And I'm just making a change to one of the little windows. Notice that it's not a cutout one, it's got a dark window in there. And I'm going to change it because it's quite recognisable in the castle. And just add in a few of the darkest windows. So here I'm just using quite a flat part of the pastel, and I'm really just scumbling some colour on. So I'm trying to think of the texture of the stonework on the castle, and without having to go into any detail, how can I make it look a little bit rough? So out of interest, let's work on at the rest of the piece and block everything in so that we get a good clear view of the colours before starting to work on the next layers. So this grassy area in the foreground has got a lovely punch of colour to it. I really love the shadows that all the little bits of wall cast. And I especially love that yellowy green that the setting sun has turned the grass. So that's the great thing about soft pastel, you can block things in so quickly. And sometimes that just gives you a better sense of what's going on with your painting. Things can look very odd when they're in progress, and then all of a sudden you get another area of colour in and it can start to make sense. So I often find if I'm in doubt on a certain area, sometimes just working on around that area can help you think a bit clearer and see what needs to change in the area that you were struggling with before. So I want to block in some of this lovely rich green with a lot of yellow in it. And I think a nice strong splash of this colour in the foreground will really help this piece sing. So I hope you're enjoying this if you're working along. I've stopped so many times for tea breaks that I actually don't know if I've managed to do this within 2 hours. We'll see at the very end. But if it's a little more, we'll not worry. hopefully I can get the basis of it finished within the 2 hours and give you guys all the knowledge that you'll need to finish it off, add the finishing touches. So I'm not colouring it in really solidly, just trying to block it in loosely. But already that starts to give us a good sense of the contrast that we're going to get in the foreground. So just trying to find where those nice little fences come along, cutting this foreground area off. So just a few more little bits of texture through the sea. Really helps sometimes to get a bit of foreground in. Just helps you see how much more detail you might want to add to the layers behind. And I just want to help some of these little bits of wall stand out nicely using some bits of light lilac foam. So just picking out some of the tops of those bits of foam. So I really want to try and break up a lot of the black that I've applied already. And if you've got a nice range of dark colours, you can experiment with what might work here. I'm still trying to keep everything nice and warm, really glowing in the sunset light. So I'm bringing in some of the dark purple that I've used elsewhere in the painting, just to break up the darkness of the walls. I also want to bring in a little bit more green in these shadows before adding some different colours through there to help the shadow effect. So again, I'm going to bring in some purple in these areas. Purple and green seems to be used a lot in this painting. So again, just trying to play around with colour really. Putting some purple in the shadows on the green grass. I've been making some videos recently all about colour theory. So if you'd like to learn a little bit more about how to use colour theory in your work, be sure to check out my other playlists here on YouTube. I'll also add some links in the description to this video to some other videos that might be of help if you're just starting out. Now that I've got this foreground area in, I can really start to darken down this cliff face and the castle up above. Remember just to keep looking for the darkest areas. You're looking for the shadows first. Then your midtones, you should be trying to further describe the shape and form, and also use that as an opportunity sometimes to bring in some more vibrant colours. So just align a little bit of a more muted dark green into this cliff face. You can see very little colour in here. Just some areas where it's creeping up towards the light. So at this point, I'm starting to think about where I need to make darker on the cliffs. And it's mostly down in here at the base of the cliffs. Of course, I'm going to come back through this with some colour, but I want to make sure that I have some of those darkest areas in first. It helps just being a bit scratchy with your motion on this, just to give some hint at the texture of the rock face. And again, just using some of my darkest brown tone to darken up around this top area again. I'm going to lighten this whole side of the painting in a minute, so it doesn't matter at this stage if I feel it's a little bit too dark. And again I can come in with this blue. And just pick out a few little bits of the cool coloured stone. Now I want to start and bring some of the warmth from this top area of the painting down into the castle, so I'm going to use perhaps the lighter one, some of that peachy orange from the sky earlier, and I'm just going to drag that right down over the land, over the castle, sort of making like sun rays. Just very lightly touching the paper. And then very gently blending that in. You can do that a few times just to add a bit of colour down through the castle. And that just starts to soften the light coming this way from the setting sun, and leaving over here more contrasted and in the shadows. Also taking that lovely vibrant colour, I can start to add some little highlights of colour in my foreground. Just using this lovely coral orange as a good complementary colour to all that green in the foreground. And also it makes sense because some of this colour would be shining on the land from the warmth of the setting sun. Also maybe add a little hint of light along the walls. Some highlights on the grass. Not being too particular with this. Just choosing some areas to add a little bit of colour to. Other good areas are around the outskirts of a shadow. And I'm not using a pure outline as such. Sort of broken line. Just adding little hints of that colour. And then just to help bring out some of the foreground a little bit more, of a lighter green, just to pick out a few bits of highlight in the very foreground area. I don't want them to stand out too much. Now there's some little fence posts just along here, standing out against the ocean. And if one doesn't go quite to plan, you can always neaten it up with the background colour. And again, perhaps a few little bits of highlight, just catching the posts. So again, just as a tip to break up some of your black areas, I'm using the darkest purple that I've been using, and that just really helps to break up the black, letting some of it shine through. But it's really the purple that catches your eye. I'm just trying to pick out one or two little areas in the cliffs that will just give this area a bit more interest, bringing some of the green across and also adding some of the purple down into the rocks. So just a final bit of dusting of light. Just bringing this right across the castle front and down into that valley. The light has really dusted across this part of the land as well, so just about continuing the sunlight and keeping those colours consistent. So I think I can just about call this finished. On a bigger scale, I could spend many days on this particular landscape. But on this scale, I'm quite happy to leave things looking a little bit more unfinished. And I hope that if you've been working along, you can see just how quickly you can start to get good effects with soft pastel. You can spend ages on something and get a very high level of realism, but you can still get a certain level of realism even when you work quickly. So that's it, and I hope that if you've been painting along with me, you've got yourself your own little Dunluce Castle. If you liked this tutorial, please do subscribe here on my YouTube channel. I'm planning to do lots more subject matters in this style of tutorial. I also have much more in-depth tutorials over on my Patreon channel. You can check that out via the links below in the description. But thanks very much for watching, and until next time, happy pasteling.